All right, welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this week's lecture of the lecture series Den Krieg, dokumentieren, Ukraine 2014-2022, documenting the war Ukraine 2014-2022. So as you notice, this is one of the English language lectures in this series. My name is Gleb Albert. I'm a historian at the Department of History at the University of Zurich, and I will be moderating today's session. I am very happy to welcome our two Ukrainian guests, Kateryna Busol and Dmytro Koval. They will speak for about 45 minutes. Is that correct? Yeah, 45 minutes. And afterwards, we will have questions and answers. So please don't be shy and put forward your questions either by raising the Zoom hand, like not like this, not the hand in front of the camera, because we will not be able to see it, but the Zoom function with the hand, or you can write your questions into the F&A or Q&A field, not in the chat field, preferably, but in the Q&A or F und A in German. And then I will read out these questions and our speakers will address them. I would like to say a few words about our speakers. Kateryna Busol is a lawyer and legal scholar. Right now, she's a fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Eastern and Southeastern European Studies in Regensburg in Germany. She's a specialist in humanitarian international law. In Ukraine, she counsels state bodies and NGOs on documenting and persecuting crimes against humanity and on cooperating with the International Criminal Court. Dmytro Koval is a legal scholar as well. He's professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy National University in Kyiv. Now he's a fellow at Stanford University. He's a specialist in international law regarding the protection of cultural heritage in times of war. He contributed to reports of several NGOs such as Truth Hounds, the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, Crimean SOS, and numerous others. Kateryna and Dmytro will speak about the pitfalls and advantages of Russia's aggression against Ukraine being the most documented situation. So, Kateryna, Dmytro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Gleb, for your kind introduction, and thank you very much all for the invitation. As mentioned, Dmytro and I will present for 45 minutes, and then we will be happy to respond to your questions, which will not necessarily, hopefully, touch upon the issues of documentation, but perhaps the wider issues of the accountability for the crime of aggression, or for the possibility for qualifying certain acts of Russia's political, military or media leaders as incitement to violence or indeed incitement to genocide. But we will start, of course, with the core, with the documentation. I'm starting to share my screen. Voilà. Dmytro and I usually start our joint presentations, of which we have many, with this picture. At the first glance, it does look like a Ukrainian flag, but if one stands and looks more attentively, and he or she sees a bigger picture, actually one sees a landscape with quite a far-reaching horizon. And this is our message, referring in a way to a painting. This is not this one, but another painting called The Bigger Picture by David Hockney, to see indeed a bigger picture and to not to jump with conclusions. The documentation of alleged international crimes within the context of Russia's aggression calls exactly for that. It calls for seeing the bigger picture, because as Dmytro and I will demonstrate, the vastness of evidence, the amount of stakeholders involved in the documentation does not necessarily lead us to one solid conclusion that this will necessarily help build qualitative cases which can be easily, quickly, and qualitatively investigated, prosecuted, and adjudicated. In our presentation, Dmytro and I will focus on three principal issues. First, we will discuss the spectrum of jurisdictions, the spectrum of domestic and international courts that can deal with conflict-related crimes perpetrated within Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Second, most crucially, we will focus on the achievements, opportunities, and challenges for the documentation of conflict-related crimes in Ukraine. And here I should specify two things. First, with respect to conflict-related crimes, Dmytro and I mean war crimes, crimes against humanity, possibly genocide, and the crime of aggression. So the so-called four core international crimes. And second, as you will see, we will stress that when speaking about the documentation and indeed the conflict-related crimes themselves, we speak about these crimes which have been perpetrated not only on a horrific scale since February this year, but indeed since the very beginning of Russia's aggression, namely since the occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014. And finally, in our third section of our presentation, we will discuss the dynamics of domestic prosecution of conflict-related crimes in Ukraine. Currently, we move to the first part of our presentation, which analyzes the different courts that have the possibility to adjudicate the cases related to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And here I pass the floor to Dmytro.
Thank you, Kateryna, for these introductory remarks. And indeed, we are ready to start diving into the substance of our presentation. And I want to begin our conversation today with this reminder that Ukraine has recognized the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which is the most authoritative international criminal court over there in the market. And that's the primary, probably, suspect for the investigation of different crimes committed in Ukraine when it comes to international arena. But let's quickly recollect how it became possible, how Ukraine recognized this jurisdiction of the ICC. It was 2014 when the first declaration of our parliament, of Verkhovna Rada, was adopted right after Russia started its occupation then of Crimea on February 25th. Verkhovna Rada reacted on that and passed the declaration. After that, this declaration was passed to the International Criminal Court through the Embassy of Ukraine to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In 2015, Ukraine adopted another declaration. We can move to the next slide. And that declaration and was different from the first one, since the first referred only those cases to the ICC, or those crimes that were committed during the Revolution of Dignity and during the Euromaidan protests that started in the end of November 2013. But this later declaration, it asked the International Criminal Court to investigate and adjudicate cases that stem from the Russian aggression in the east of Ukraine in the two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk regions, where Russia launched sometimes proxy, sometimes a direct war against Ukraine, also in 2014. Again, there was the two-step process. Verkhovna Rada adopted the resolution on February 4th, and then this time Ministry of Foreign Affairs submitted this declaration, rewritten, I would say, declaration to the International Criminal Court. This, excuse me, this is a quick reminder about the grounds on which ICC got the power to investigate the crimes committed in Ukraine. And this involvement of the International Criminal Court from the very beginning had certain consequences that I frame here as unexpected consequences, since they are not like directly connected to the main functions of the ICC. Also, these consequences, they kind of illustrate what the former prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, was saying once when she, answering the question about the effectiveness of the ICC, said that the most effective, the measurement of effectiveness doesn't really depend on the number of cases that ICC is investigating. She said that, in fact, if the ICC is just preventing the crimes and just helping the national jurisdiction or stimulating national jurisdictions to investigate international crime, that would be the sign of the most effective international criminal court. And in some regard, we witnessed this in Ukraine since 2014 until 2022, because indeed the ICC was just preliminary studying the situation in Ukraine, and despite that, it significantly influenced the landscape in Ukraine itself with regards to documentation, investigation, and adjudication of war crimes. But let's start from the very beginning. The involvement of the ICC from the very start increased the attention of human rights organizations and what is also important, donors to the situation of Ukraine. When the crimes or when the atrocities are framed in a way that we refer to them as the war crimes situation, or the situation where crimes against humanity are being committed, that definitely means that the situation will attract attention of different stakeholders, including human rights defenders and donors who support the documentation work. Then another consequence of the ICC involvement was the birth of the specialized organizations, non-governmental organizations focused on documentation of international crimes. Before 2014, Ukraine had, there were several large human rights organizations and also regional initiatives that worked in the field of human rights, protection, in the field of some adjacent fields dealing with different aspects of human rights. But there were no organization really concentrated on the idea of documenting grave violations of human rights or international crimes. And the involvement of the ICC, the attention of the ICC, and the idea that the work of non-governmental organization may later condense into the real cases in the ICC fueled this process of creation of the new organization specialized on documentation. Also, this led, the involvement of the ICC led to the creation of the specialized war crimes unit within the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, and also special war crimes units, investigatory units in the Ukrainian police and security service of Ukraine. Again, that would have not been possible without the attention of the ICC to the situation, without the need to cooperate with the ICC and to conduct national investigations to basically prevent the ICC involvement in the cases where Ukraine is fully capable to do its own job, to investigate and prosecute crimes domestically. Also, what happened since 2014 is the increased capacity, the capacity of Ukrainian prosecutors increased when it comes to the investigation of war crimes. This happened because many technical assistance projects were launched by the US, by the European Union, by other countries, and also some national organization, non-governmental organization invested in trainings of prosecutors and police officers and the officers of security service of Ukraine. So with these trainings, with the teaching materials, with the different guidelines on war crimes, Ukrainian prosecutors became much and much more capable to investigate the crimes, to apply international law and to comprehend international law during the investigations. So that's generally what we call unexpected consequences, what helped to change shape the landscape in Ukraine with regards to documentation. And as announced, we also want to touch in this section the issue of competing jurisdiction. So as you see now, there are fully capable Ukrainian institutions that may deal with war crimes. But of course, these institutions were tailored, were programmed to investigate much less amount of crimes than we witness today. Basically, they were created to investigate crimes committed in Crimea and in two regions from the east, Donetsk and Lugansk region, where those crimes were concentrated. But now we see that the situation is very much different. There is maybe just a few regions of Ukraine where no war crimes have been committed. So despite my previous statement that these institutions are fully capable to investigate war crimes in Ukraine, there are still issues of lack of resources, since now these units have to deal with much larger amount of crimes than before. But apart from the national institutions, there are also other actors that may play a role in documenting, prosecuting and adjudicating war crimes and other international crimes. ICC was mentioned already, and now you know why it has its jurisdiction. But there are also other options, for instance, foreign courts that may utilize principle of universal jurisdiction and using it get involved into investigation of international crimes committed in Ukraine. Of course, universal jurisdiction now doesn't look like it looked 15 years or 17 years ago, but still it allows in certain instances, in certain cases, to start investigation, to launch inquiries into events in Ukraine. There is also the idea of the creation of specialized ad hoc international tribunal that would deal with the crimes committed in Ukraine. I think Kateryna later will touch upon the tribunal on aggression, but here I would just mention that there are also ideas of creating specialized international or hybrid tribunal that would deal with war crimes committed in Ukraine and will complement national and international jurisdiction. And some advocates of this approach say that the quantity of crimes and their gravity is so high, so tremendous, that it's just impossible for the ICC, even together with domestic courts and domestic prosecutors, to deal with all those crimes. We can, I think, go further and speak about documentation. And here I return the mic to Kateryna.
Thank you very much, Dmytro. And now, colleagues, we will indeed look into the key actors involved into the documentation of atrocities in Ukraine. And this is indeed a uniting thread, the issue of documentation, because while Dmytro has very insightfully and in great detail described to you the whole spectrum of domestic, international, and potentially hybrid courts and tribunals that might look and are already looking into conflict-related crimes in Ukraine, all of them, all those already existing and those that possibly might be created, like the potential aggression tribunal or like a potential hybrid tribunal, will of course and do of course hugely depend not just on evidence, but on the quality of evidence and on the quality of the arguments that provide the explanation of the linkage of this evidence to particular atrocities on the ground and to particular people, individuals, because we're speaking about the individual criminal responsibility. And in this second section, Dmytro and I wanted to discuss with you the key state and civil society actors involved in the documentation of conflict-related crimes in Ukraine since 2014 and how their effort has developed since then. We start with the state side, and as Dmytro mentioned, Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office started looking into the cases related to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Crimea and in Donbass since 2014. A specialized prosecutor's office for Crimea and for Donbass was established. So in this regard, there has been the domestic expertise in documenting, analyzing the evidence, and preparing the indictments and preparing the cases for further adjudication. With the full-scale invasion of this year, what has changed is that in May this year, Ukraine's international partners, namely the UK, the EU, and the United States, have jointly supported the establishment of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. This advisory group is essentially helping the Prosecutor General's office to deal with the increased number of atrocities, but also with the more varied spectrum of these atrocities, because indeed the amount of either targeted shelling of civilian objects or of indiscriminate shelling or the diversification of the forms of sexual violence are the phenomena that have developed, unfortunately, since February 2022. So while the Ukrainian side, the state side, has had the experience of dealing with conflict-related violations, both the number of the crimes and their new variety has necessitated the new international help. And why this Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group has also a particular potential is because of the mobile justice units established within it. The mobile justice units combine the domestic Ukrainian and international professionals, legal analysts, forensic specialists, investigators, and prosecutors. And this is precious exactly because of this combination of the international expertise of international lawyers who have argued the cases before the International Criminal Court, before the International Specialized Tribunal for Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia, but also they joined their effort with Ukrainian professionals who know very well the domestic context and the domestic crime scene. And as regards the investigation, as already mentioned, both the National Police and the Security Service of Ukraine are the key actors involved in the first stage in the investigation, and therefore they also have their feet firmly on the ground, gathering the evidence for the cases run primarily by the Ukrainian courts, but also forwarded further to the International Criminal Court for the possible consideration within the cases by the ICC in The Hague. What becomes more interesting is when we look at the civil society documentation effort in Ukraine, and it is quite diverse. As Dmytro has mentioned, both the armed conflict which followed from Russia's aggression in 2014 and the government's recognition of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court have really catalyzed, have really sped up the both the desire and the effort of the Ukrainian civil society to document the cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, to first team up with domestic investigators and prosecutors and increasingly forward this evidence to them, become essentially the linkage between the state actors and victims and witnesses on the ground. But also Ukraine's civil society has become a very powerful actor internationally, drafting separate communications to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, trying to convince for 8 years the ICC to open a full investigation into the situation in Ukraine. And while the current international support for Ukraine, politics, policy, justice-wise, is really high, it should be stressed that the first 8 years of the armed conflict really did not draw that much of international attention and support. And it was really up to Ukraine's civil society that were consistently trying to convince the prosecutor in The Hague to open the relevant cases. And what are those civil society organizations? First, there are several huge NGOs that do holistic human rights work in Ukraine that have also embraced the new dimension of the armed conflict and the documentation of conflict-related crimes. And here I can name the Kharkiv Human Rights Group, the Helsinki Human Rights Union, and of course, the Center for Civil Liberties, the recent one of the 3 recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize of this year. Second, Ukraine has had the new NGOs that were focused not just on the broad human rights work, but were targeted specifically for the documentation of war-related crimes. And the examples of such include Truth Hounds and the recently established Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. Also, a particular group is a group of NGOs formed by those relocated civil society organizations from the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine. And it's interesting that the heads of these organizations, their driving force, are usually the IDPs, the people themselves most directly affected by Russia's aggression. And here, Dmytro and I provide the examples of the Crimean Human Rights Group and the Regional Center for Human Rights. And while you might wonder why these 2 presenters today pay so much attention to these names, well, because these names matter, not only because the civil society has a very strong standing, as I mentioned, for instance, in their legacy of submitting the communications to the ICC, just now as the first parliamentary summit of the Crimea platform is coming to an end, we would like to stress that, for instance, Crimean Human Rights Group is the leading NGO that is teaming up with the government and with Ukraine's international partners to really put the whole scope of the issues related to Crimea, not only to the investigation and prosecution of the crimes related to the occupation, but also in relation to the occupation of the peninsula, in relation to transitional justice. So these civil society organizations, they really have a strong standing both internationally and domestically, and their standing transcends just the documentation. It really embraces the issues also of deoccupation and of rebuilding of Ukraine. Also, Ukraine does have the NGOs that focus on the documentation of particular conflict-related crimes. For instance, as kindly mentioned by Gleb, Dmytro and I specialize, one of our specializations is the crimes against cultural heritage. And for instance, such an NGO as the Crimean Institute for Strategic Research is focused specifically on the documentation and policy advice on preserving heritage in the time of war. And of course, there are international NGOs that have worked on Ukraine or in Ukraine on a wider array of human rights issues, which have also understandably embraced the challenges of the armed conflict, including in the domain of the documentation. And the most obvious examples would be Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. What has changed significantly within the civil society sector since the full-scale invasion of February this year? First, 2 leading coalitions of Ukrainian domestic NGOs have been formed. First, the 5am coalition, named after the timing when President Putin announced the so-called special military operation against Ukraine. And second, the Tribunal for Putin coalition, which is quite self-explanatory in its name, which calls for justice both for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, but also for the crime of aggression. And I really hope that, if not in the main presentation, but in the Q&A, we will touch upon this issue of the prosecution of the crime of aggression and why it stands in a way separately and why it raises the separate particular challenges. also certain NGOs, and I would say that there are many of them that have in a way discovered the Russia-Ukraine conflict after the full-scale invasion and really indeed want to so-called, if we could say so, to enter the market and to start their work in Ukraine and on Ukraine. And this is both an opportunity as a challenge because, of course, these NGOs don't really know the particularities of the armed conflict, the developments, the undercurrents that have happened since 2014 on the one hand. On the other hand, if approached qualitatively, if approached with due respect to domestic professionals and to their expertise and teaming up with them, that could still produce a good result, the involvement of even such new NGOs. Such multiplicity of efforts and actors, both on the state side and on the civil society side. And we, of course, should mention that when we speak about the non-civil society effort, when we speak about the state effort, we speak not only about Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors working on the documentation, but we also speak about the investigative teams of the International Criminal Court and the investigative teams of other countries, which, as Dmytro has mentioned, have opened or are considering opening the cases on the basis of the principle of universal jurisdiction. Such multiplicity of effort has given rise to a number of challenges. First, it is the challenge of the over-documentation of the volumes of evidence, which is more fact-based, but which is so big and so hard to process in terms of the legal analysis, in terms of building the understanding of the patterns of the crimes, of the patterns of the victimization, and most importantly, in harmonizing the different pieces of evidence potentially related to one crime or one group of survivors from different documenting stakeholders. Second, there is no overarching evidence storage or analysis database, and this is more of a especially domestic Ukrainian problem. Ukraine, both at the state and at the civil society, has tried to form essentially a single database of evidence, and also the harmonized methodology of evidence collection. And the development of these was quite underway, especially in 2019, 2020, and 2021, when Ukraine was also developing for the first time a holistic transitional justice framework. But unfortunately, this effort was stalled by the full-scale invasion, and the lack of such single methodology and single evidence storage can be felt now. Then the NGOs not necessarily also have this well-synchronized strategy and methodology for documenting conflict-related crimes. For instance, it took a while, the mentioned coalitions, to, for instance, figure out which NGOs would specialize more on particular types of crimes, for instance, such as enforced disappearances or conflict-related sexual violence. In the same way, it takes a while to ensure, for instance, that the same areas and the same survivors are not subject to the duplication of efforts, to the repeated interviewing by different NGOs. Of course, the problem is that also many NGOs are seen as too proactive and too advocating of the Ukrainian position. And Dmytro and I have singled out this as an issue on the one hand. On the other hand, I think increasingly more NGOs realize this issue, and they have been also consistent in saying that the crimes perpetrated by all sides to the conflict should be investigated and prosecuted. And indeed, Ukraine has had the proceedings related to the alleged crimes of the so-called Tornado Battalion, also when advocating for the ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as amending domestic criminal legislation. Ukraine's leading human rights NGOs often stress that it should be the interests of survivors which should be at the center of the justice efforts, which means that all crimes by all sides should be investigated and prosecuted, on the one hand. On the other hand, both the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and recently the members of the Special UN Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine have also confirmed that it strongly appears that the vast majority of crimes is being perpetrated by the Russian side. Therefore, there shouldn't be as much bias as that could be with respect to the position of Ukrainian NGOs. And here, for the other key challenges, I will pass the floor to Dmytro to comment on them.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. I will just maybe add a few quick points to the previous challenges that you have already discussed. Really quick, I want to add a bit to the issue of the overarching evidence storage, since that's indeed a big challenge, but not only for Ukraine, for any country that finds itself in the situation of large-scale atrocity crimes. So what is happening in situations both in Ukraine and in other places is that many actors that either have their own evidence storage databases or have some partnership in which they use certain databases, they approach different Ukrainian actors and different actors in other countries and basically propose their services, propose their databases as the best solution on the market. And there is nothing bad about that, but with this comes, of course, uncertainty and different the competition of tastes, we can say, when some NGOs, some state bodies as well, like and prefer one type of databases, while others prefer other different databases. And again, this is a very normal situation, but it harms a bit the documentation process, and especially it harms the building of cases, the building on the linkaging of cases with the perpetrators, with the victims, and with the location. So that's indeed a challenge, but again, the challenge that many countries really face. And also, I just want to second what Kateryna was saying about Ukrainian NGOs. Despite sometimes they use, and quite often I have to admit, they use very pro-Ukrainian language in their reports and in their public statements, they indeed have a clear understanding that all the perpetrators of international crimes should be brought to justice. The NGO that I work most closely with, the Truth Hounds, we also worked with the prosecutors of Ukraine to initiate certain proceedings where the alleged perpetrators of what we thought may be classified as a war crime were Ukrainian citizens. So there is no taboo in Ukraine to speak about that and to approach prosecutors and investigators to launch the inquiries into the incidents. But at the same time, even keeping this in mind, still the language that Ukrainian NGOs use is not neutral. But here we can say that there are like two poles. One which is formed by the NGOs, the local NGOs that indeed use not the very neutral language and sometimes depict the events with the bits of emotions, and on the other pole is very neutral and maybe even one can say too neutral organization that depict the events as if all the situations are very similar, as if the parties have the similar status in the conflict and there is no aggressor state, no defending party, no the one that started the invasion. So this neutrality sometimes leads to the also to misinterpretation of the context and not catching some essential aspects of the aggressive war. So speaking about the Ukrainian NGOs, we have to understand that there is also two sides, the good and bad in how they form the arguments. And turning to two uncovered yet challenges, I will start with the increase of these requests, demand on the expertise. Indeed, as I was telling, as I was saying in the very beginning of this presentation, the number of crimes dramatically increased, both in terms of the number and in terms of the geographical spread. If until 2022 only 3 regions of Ukraine, namely Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk regions, were affected by the conflict and by the international crimes, now almost all the regions are affected in this or that way. Many regions were under the occupation of the Russian forces in February and in March. Some remain under the occupation, at least parts of them remain under the occupation even now. And in other regions, Russia very often attacked civilian buildings and civilian infrastructure that may well be classified as war crimes. Of course, it's not a given that the damage of civilian infrastructure or civilian buildings necessarily should be treated as a war crime, but still there is this definitely chance that such crimes may be classified this way. So returning to this idea of increased demand, now the prosecutors, investigators, and other involved professionals in so many regions need this basic knowledge on what is international humanitarian law, how it works, what are the grave breaches of international humanitarian law that constitute war crimes. So this demand is indeed really significant, and it increased. It's not that easy to satisfy it just with attracting more international experts to Ukraine, because these international experts should know a bit about Ukrainian context. They should have the capacity to either travel to the regions where the expertise is needed, or conduct online trainings. And with online trainings, we all know how sometimes ineffective they may be, how easy it is to lose attention, especially when the interpretation is involved. So it remains a challenge, this increase in the quantity of crimes and increased demand on the expertise. And last but not least, there is the issue of re-traumatization and the principle of do not harm. Sometimes even the goodwill stakeholders, goodwill organization that really want to help the investigation efforts and want to document as many war crimes and violations of human rights as possible, bring together with these inquiries some potential harm to survivors and victims. I will speak here from my own experience, since I did a couple of field missions to the regions that were under Russian occupation in March, and I witnessed very different atmosphere there in May 2022 and in August of the same year. In May, every Ukrainian who we met wanted to speak very openly about the atrocities he or she witnessed, and they wanted the witness statements to be shared with all potential institutions that might be interested in the statements, including prosecutors, investigators, international criminal courts, journalists, and archives. But in August, the situation changed severely. The witnesses quite often just agreed to speak for a limited number of topics and for a very limited time. They started to refuse to allow sharing their information, their statements with the relevant stakeholders, especially domestic stakeholders. And that happened not because domestic stakeholders like prosecutors or investigators somehow harmed the witnesses or victims or compromised themselves or did something that was perceived as a move into the wrong direction. No, it's just a symbol of general tiredness, the reaction on this over documentation, over attention to the region that were affected by the armed conflict. Too many actors, including also journalists, approached victims and witnesses, and now they are closing up and they do not want so openly share the information that they may have. I'll stop here, and I think we can move to the next slide.
Just a small addition on this final point, because it's so important, the do no harm principle and the avoidance of the second or even third and fourth trauma to the survivors. It is particularly topical for the particular groups of especially vulnerable survivors. And I worked a lot, unfortunately, with survivors of conflict-related crimes in Russia's aggression. And these people are already so brave when, after this horrific experience, both women and men are ready to speak up and provide the evidence to investigators and prosecutors. But when so much good willingness comes from the human rights lawyers, from NGOs, from investigators and prosecutors, both domestic and international, that closes up a person, and most importantly, that usually makes them relieve those horrific days and that horrific experience they have had. Therefore, currently, both the civil society has the more work on that, and Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General has developed a special guidelines on treating the victims and witnesses of sexual violence. So while certain damage has been done, it is promising to see that both the state and the civil society actors recognize the flawed work in this regard, and they're trying to develop a more caring, a more sensitized approach to vulnerable survivors pursuant to the principle of do no harm. And here we turn to the final part of our presentation, which will probably try to provide an overview of and then engage on with you in a more interactive manner. It's essentially how this volume of evidence and documentation effort that we have just spoken about impacted the dynamics of Ukraine's domestic prosecution of conflict-related crimes. Dmytro, over to you.
Thank you, Kateryna. You see this slide with a print screen from the side of the Ukrainian Office of Prosecutor General. It's in Cyrillic, but you see the numbers, and I will comment now on them. So last week, this information dates back to the end of last week. Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors registered more than 40,000 incidents that may be classified as war crimes. Then there were 18,000 of crimes against national security, which are the crimes of high treason and also collaboration with the Russian authorities. Also, there are 626 persons who, according to Ukrainian prosecutors, could have participated in the commission of the crime of aggression. And those 626 persons, they are ministers of the Russian government, they are Russian MPs, they are military commanders, and different type of other officials, and those who shape a Russian policy, for instance, including the propagandists self-proclaimed journalist from the Russian Federation who openly demanded the attacks or the aggression against Ukraine, and now they are continuing their work in different ways, urging the state to continue the armed conflict and to achieve better successes by attacking civilian infrastructure and civilian objects. I think we can move further. And I will be very brief here since we are running out of time, and to just show you the article that criminalizes war crimes in Ukraine. It is very much imperfect since it doesn't bring clarity on what particular war crimes are recognized by the Ukrainian Criminal Code, and it's very general in nature. But still, at the same time, and as following the lines of our today's presentation, everything almost have two sides. So on the negative side, of course, this article is not precise enough to enable qualitative criminal proceedings, but at the same time, it's also quite vague enough or broad enough to allow prosecution of all grave violations of international humanitarian law as they recognized by the Rome Statute and also by the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1 to Geneva Convention. So in a way, this article allows Ukrainian prosecutors to go after all those who committed war crimes as they defined by international community. Can move to the next slide. Here we list a couple of challenges for the documentation and investigation of war crimes in particular. And there comes the lack of expertise of criminal justice professionals, and this lack of expertise very much connected to the increase of the number of crimes and expanded territorial scope of crimes. We have already discussed this on the previous in the previous section. Also, there is lack of coordination, and here we mean not only lack of coordination between governmental and non-governmental sectors and actors, but also there is lack of coordination between national or central authorities sitting in Kyiv and some local agencies sitting in Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and other regions. Because the central bodies, as you can imagine, they are overwhelmed with work, overwhelmed with not only taking part in the investigations, but also in coordination of international help, communication with the International Criminal Court, cooperation with the non-governmental organization. They sometimes can't really pay enough attention to the products, to the work that is being done in the regions. So this lack of coordination and lack of understanding sometimes also causes certain challenges and causes certain problems for the investigation of war crimes. Then in imperfect domestic criminal legislation on IHL and ICL, you saw the article just minutes ago that criminalizes war crimes in our criminal code, and I commented already that it's not really suitable for the investigation of war crimes. At least it's not ideal for this type of investigations. And also there are some procedural pitfalls that also impact the way investigations may be conducted. And last but not least, lack of alternative forms of redress for survivors, such as reparations. We started to think about the schemes that would provide reparations before this full-scale invasion, but they were never fully implemented into Ukrainian legislation because of the armed conflict. And now the survivors very often face this issue that they do not have enough avenues for seeking redress and reparations, and the only remaining option for them is the participation in the criminal proceedings in the procedural status of victim, which is not always an easy task and which is not very much doable, since it's often hard to get involved into war crimes trial, and there are no that many war crimes proceeding that reached the courts phase. I will stop here and pass the floor to Kateryna.
Dear colleagues, we are conscious of the time, therefore I will just conclude with, as I mentioned previously, the particular, in a way, standalone crime, the crime of aggression, which according to the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal is the crime that triggers the commission of all other crimes. And while Ukraine has done much in terms of the documentation and investigation of potential crimes domestically, the crime of aggression, the leadership crime, unfortunately cannot be addressed fully by Ukraine itself domestically, nor can it be addressed by the ICC because of the certain very restricted jurisdiction for this crime within the International Criminal Court. Therefore, Ukraine has initiated this idea of creating the Special Aggression Tribunal for the crime which can be attributed to Russia's top military and political leadership. There have been efforts, and Dmytro and I have put a print screen analyzing one of them, of Ukraine looking at aggression domestically in its own courts and missing the point and attributing the ability to launch the war of aggression to just the low-level Russian officers, the low-level perpetrators, but exactly because it is the crime that is launched by the top political and military leadership who enjoy the immunity. Both the evidence of this crime and its consideration is possible only by a special entity internationally. And therefore, while the evidence gathering of the crime of aggression is ongoing, the forum for considering this evidence is yet to be established. And this is where Dmytro and I would like to stop our presentation and hopefully discuss this and other issues of interest for you and us in the Q&A section. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting and very important and highly informative talk. I have actually lots of questions and comments, but I will restrict myself to just one because we are running out of time, and I hope others will participate as well. I mean, the title of your, or the part of the title of your talk, where you said that this is one of the most documented situations, it spoke very strongly to me, however, in a different way than you addressed it in the talk in the end. Because I mean, I have very little legal expertise. I knew only a few of the NGOs you mentioned, but I mean, this phenomenon of over documentation is not only so like seeable for law specialists and prosecutors, but also for the general Twitter or Telegram user. I mean, in the weeks and months after February 24th, not as a lawyer, but as a historian, I was just sitting days and days in shock and awe watching my Twitter feed and the Telegram groups that I'm subscribed to. And I mean, all sorts of materials get posted there, and many of them actually do document, or at least seem to document, and in many cases, of course, do document war crimes and crimes against humanity. So what is the status of all this, like, so to say, documentation from below? All these random footage that gets posted? Like, is there any authority that proactively searches for it, documents it? Most importantly, what is their value as evidence when it finally will come to actual trials? So this sort of documentation from below, what is the status of it, and how are Ukrainian actors dealing with it? like those that are supposed to prepare future trials?
I can say again, based on experience on the organization that I most closely work with, from the very first day of the aggression, of this new phase of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we started to collect all those videos, footages, pictures that were appearing online, and archive them, properly describe them, and also check where it's possible to create the database just on the cloud storage somewhere of this material. It's not necessarily that all those materials will be used during the investigation, but at least they may help to direct the investigation to a right way. And if saved properly, if there are all the codes saying when the video was taken and where it was taken, maybe these saved, stored pieces may even be used as evidence in the court. There are ways for Ukrainian prosecutors, for instance, using creatively our procedural code to say that we received this information. This information should be taken into consideration in the criminal proceeding. Of course, it's not enough to show videos and photos only. You have to supplement them with witness statements, with some expertise saying which weapons were used, how exactly certain civilians were killed or tortured, or how other types of crimes were committed against civilians. So that's also needed. But still, video and photo materials may help in the investigation stage, Maybe Kateryna can add something to that.
Thank you, Dmytro. I would add just one aspect. When we speak about international crimes, we usually, as lawyers, and the experience of international tribunals shows that, want to hold accountable not only a direct perpetrator of a crime, a person who raped or looted, but also a person who was in command. And the higher we get in the chain of command, the better. The challenge, of course, is to connect that violence on the ground to that commander who oftentimes sits far away. And I think this linkage evidence is something which is the trickiest for the grassroots documentation, because oftentimes, especially NGOs or the so-called first responders, like the ordinary civilians who would see the crime scene and film it, for instance, they document this initial first level of perpetration. But the challenge further is to actually aggregate different pieces of evidence from different stakeholders to build up as possible this chain of command, and of course to get to those who either gave those criminal orders or failed to punish the perpetrators on the ground for the commission of the crimes.
Thank you very much. And I think one could add that this war is probably the first war where digital forensics will play, or are already playing, an immense role especially in making sense of especially of this like first responder footage and so on. I would like to address one more thing. Maybe it is of interest for many of our viewers. Maybe one of the more controversial kinds of footage that can be found online right now are these like interviews with prisoners of war. And I mean, I think there are legal discussions about it. There are like civil society discussions about it. Like, is it illegal to interview them or is it not, and so on and so forth. Is there any like legal discussion going on about how, like, whether this footage is usable as evidence? Like, let's say if Russian prisoners of war confess to war crimes on a video that is filmed and then put on YouTube.
I will probably, if you allow me, Kateryna, I will start and then pass the floor to you. So the issue that was discussed in Ukraine, but frankly, in April and May, not now, because now we do not see like fresh interviews of prisoners of war, was whether it's even legal to ask the prisoners of war to give these interviews. The department in the university where we work with Kateryna prepared the legal opinion concerning this issue, and basically it stated that indeed international humanitarian law protects the prisoners of war from the interest of public, which may mean that they should not go public and should not be exposed with all the deeds and crimes and other things that they potentially committed. So there was this idea that maybe it's not the best scenario for Ukraine to expose itself to the allegation in violation of international humanitarian law. At the same time, another conclusion of the same legal opinion was that in certain instances, in certain cases, it is allowed to organize this type of interviews. And that is when the public demand or the public interest is so high that if you further remain silent on the issue, if you further prevent the prisoners of war going public, you kind of impede the right of the public, Ukrainian public, to know the details about how the aggression started, how exactly certain crimes were committed, who was in the command in the unit that were the most responsible for the mass atrocities. So there is also this balance between public demand for truth and the rights of victims to be mentioned here as well, and the rights of the prisoners of war. In any case, general recommendation of that legal opinion was to significantly decrease the use of this type of interviews because they harm the public image of Ukraine. As you could see, this really happened. So the Ukrainian authorities recognized that it was maybe a mistake, maybe not, but they still decided to be on the safe side and stop this practice. At least it's not widespread anymore. But turning to your other question, whether this material, whether these interviews may be used in the criminal proceedings, I doubt that. But they again can guide on the very initial stages of the investigations, where to look, what units to investigate, etc., etc. So for this purpose, this interview, of course, may be some kind of guide, but not as evidence themselves.
I would like to add, actually, I think the first major controversy with the Russian prisoners of war arose when the video of alleged shooting into the feet of the Russian prisoners of war appeared. And at least public policy-wise, but of course also justice-wise, it was, I think, very important that the Ukrainian government reacted promptly by saying that first, the specialized institution will be established for dealing with the Russian prisoners of war, and we know that there was obviously a correct step because their number is mounting, and at least then they declared that any alleged misconduct would be investigated and prosecuted. In the same vein, when the public announcement essentially not to hold the prisoners of war captive was kind of published, again, there was the reaction from the armed forces saying that they do abide by the laws and customs of warfare and that this is not the manifestation of the Ukrainian armed forces policy. What I'm just saying is that, of course, the mere declaration of statements does not say that it's always so black and white in the real life, But I guess that this is very important, including for holding potentially certain Ukrainian authorities accountable to see whether they understand where their obligations pertaining to the treatment of the prisoners of war stand, and that they do demonstrate the progress in treating the prisoners of war correctly. And I fully agree with Dmytro that having the interviews with the prisoners of war for the public is one thing, but getting the evidence from them for a court of law is a different thing. But of course, if in a certain way, certain phrase can be interpreted as the one potentially relevant to guiding for the criminal proceeding, that would be a possibly viable option for the investigators and prosecutors to try and proceed with that particular prisoners of war within the already then criminal justice process, which at the stage of the pre-trial investigation will be closed to the public and of course will not be broadcast the way the other interviews were.
Thank you very much. That was very detailed and all-encompassing. But perhaps I should stop feeding my own curiosity here and get some questions in. And we have the first question by Ninetta Giorgio, who asks, and I quote, "Is over-documentation a kind of a luxury problem compared to the situation of earlier conflicts? Is it a very new phenomenon? And does it rather complicate or help the prosecution compared to earlier situations?"
I could start here, Dmytro, if you don't mind. I've actually managed to Google a relevant article and posted it in the chat, the legacies of other over-documented cases. And I must say that on the one hand, Ukraine is unique because Ukraine, luckily, as of now, has a standing government and has the not just very active human rights NGO community, but the human rights NGO community that, as we with Dmytro have demonstrated, has already for 8 years been documenting the crimes. So factually and in terms of the actual capacity and the presence on the ground, there are many viable actors who can do the documentation. On the other hand, with the Syrian armed conflict or with the Rohingya crisis, there still was a very high degree of the documentation on the ground, and actually the phenomenon of the first responder documentation and digital evidence by the first respondent emerged particularly strongly with the Syrian armed conflict. So in this regard, Ukraine is not new in terms of both the first responders documentation and the volume of evidence. But of course, Ukraine in a certain way has a kind of bigger advantage because of, again, the presence of the government and the civil society, which are on the ground and on the same side. But I particularly posted this article about the over-documentation of the Rohingya situation because first, it was quite a localized situation and still it was over-documented. Second, like Ukraine, it suffered from this influx of international actors willing to seek justice for the Rohingyas, but unfortunately, oftentimes re-traumatizing the survivors again and again. And we could see essentially the same challenges that Ukraine should learn from when, for instance, both women and men, the survivors of sexual violence in the Rohingya situation, would be over-interviewed by numerous state and NGO actors. And of course, exactly this also negative experience is something that Ukraine should learn from.
I will add to this just one aspect. We'll be paraphrasing Timothy Snyder here, who recently in the conference in Berlin stressed that in Ukraine we actually have overabundance of evidence speaking to the existence of the crime of genocide. And this overabundance, it in a way influences the minds of politicians, lawyers, and everyday men in a way that they start to question whether, in fact, these type of atrocities were committed, since there is so much information that it's really hard to believe that it indeed happened. So that's another maybe dimension of the problem, that with overabundance of evidence, overabundance of the reports, one can start questioning that indeed these atrocities of this gravity happened somewhere in Europe. So that's maybe also should be kept in mind when we approach the question about our documentation.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Also, if you're, yes, Silvia.
Yes, I have a question about the language of documentation. It was very interesting for me what you said about the neutral language, or about the too neutral language that not differentiate even though there is a difference, or that puts all the things on the same level. Can you give us an example for that?
Yes, actually, I was saying maybe less about the language of documentation, but more about the reports that are produced after the documentation. And if you look at the reports produced by Ukrainian NGOs, especially after February 24th, all of them use terms like the aggressor state, the Russian Federation that violates international humanitarian law. So without this word alleged that is usually used by international NGOs and things like that. So you will see that from the very first page, these reports condemn Russia for violating, gravely violating international humanitarian law. But international organizations, reputable international actors in the field, they of course approach the topic differently, and they start always with both sides of the conflict. They may start, not always, but they may start with both sides of the conflict, forgetting a bit about who basically started the armed conflict. They speak about the use of civilian buildings by military, again forgetting a bit that there is a difference when it comes to using of civilian infrastructure and buildings when you are attacking and when you are defending. Because if you defend the city, for instance, you can't really not use civilian buildings, because there are no other places to hide. There are no other places to shelter from the rockets and missiles coming to to your position. So these and similar issues sometimes escape the attention of the international human rights organizations, and we have this huge discussion about the Amnesty International report. Some of Ukrainian, but not only friendly Ukrainian experts were criticizing the report for not being attentive enough to the context and not really doing a great job in investigated in each and every allegation, because if it comes to using of civilian buildings, it's not enough to say that, look, you are using civilian building, you are a military man, so you are violating international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law doesn't prohibit using civilian buildings for military purpose, but it says that where it's possible, you should avoid doing this. So if you stress, if you make the allegation that someone is using a civilian object, you should show that there were good alternatives to that. Alternative that would protect your personnel, military personnel, at the same level, at the same time prevent the attacking of a civilian object. So these kind of issues arise sometimes when it comes to this over neutrality that I was referring to. I hope that I addressed your question, Sylvia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question by Ninetta Giorgio. She writes, you mentioned that the crime of aggression cannot be prosecuted by ICC. Can you explain? I think this is referring to the last part of your presentation where you were talking about the crime of aggression as such.
Well, thank you very much for opening the floor to this big discussion. I think Dmytro and I will now complement each other as we always do. I will start by saying that the International Criminal Court, under its Rome Statute, has the possibility of exercising the jurisdiction over 4 crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, which is a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population pursuant to the government's or organizational policy in wartime or without even an armed conflict. Then the 3rd crime is the crime of genocide, and the 4th one is the crime of aggression. The issue with the crime of aggression is that for the court to exercise the jurisdiction of it, both the victim state and the alleged aggressor state, I now try to not forget to use the terminology which Dmytro has just mentioned, the alleged aggressor state, should not only ratify the Rome Statute, but they should also specifically agree to the so-called Kampala amendments related to the Rome Statute related to the crime of aggression. In Ukraine's case, as Dmytro explained at the beginning of the presentation, Ukraine has recognized the jurisdiction of the court, but unfortunately, Ukraine still hasn't ratified the Rome Statute, and Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute either. Actually, Russia has withdrawn its signature from the statute shortly after the prosecutor of the ICC has issued her first report preliminary finding Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity in Crimea. So, and of course, there is no express ratification of the Kampala amendments related to the crime of aggression. So, unfortunately, essentially, the possibility of the ICC to investigate and prosecute the crime of aggression, not only with respect to the Russia-Ukraine situation, but with respect to other cases of the unlawful use of force under international law, the capability is very limited. And this is exactly the argument of Ukraine. Because the current international legal architecture is so neutralized in its possibility to offer a redress to the state and the people who are the victims of the crime of aggression, therefore Ukraine seeks the establishment of the specialized tribunal, either through the agreement with the Council of Europe or the EU, or ideally pursuant to an agreement with the UN, which of course would be tricky, as you can imagine, because getting the votes from all the members of the General Assembly would be very hard, and getting the approval of the UN Security Council because of Russia's and China's veto would be impossible. But on the parallel track, Ukraine is saying, and I think this is actually the track which Ukraine should strengthen, it says that we are not seeking something special for ourselves. We, of course, are saying that a specialized tribunal is needed because the ICC is incapacitated. And as we mentioned in the presentation, the head of state, the head of government, and the head of MFA would not be able to be prosecuted domestically for aggression in domestic courts. But at the same time, Ukraine should use this as an example that the reform to the ICC's possibility to prosecute aggression is needed to avoid any possible impunity or any possible protraction for other possible acts of aggression. So currently, we're essentially, as lawyers and as the civil society, observing this interplay of the arguments, and whether Ukraine manages to convince the international community that setting up the aggression tribunal and reforming the international legal approach to prosecuting any future cases of aggression is something that has to be done now in parallel.
I will maybe add just one quick point to that, since we have a very good question awaiting for us. And this point would be about the possibility of the International Criminal Court investigating crime of aggression when the perpetrators of those crimes hold a Ukrainian citizenship, because that may be a case theoretically. I do remember that prior to February 24th and right after the new phase of Russian aggression, there were discussions among several NGOs on whether Ukraine should approached the court with a third declaration saying that please investigate crime of aggression. And the idea was that it would kind of create the jurisdictional possibility for the court to look at the crime of aggression committed by Ukrainian citizens who collaborated with the Russian Russian Federation and who in some ways aided or abetted the aggression. But it's just a theoretical possibility, since the language of, if we read the language of the Rome Statute, of these Kampala amendments very directly, it would basically show that the Rome Statute now speaks about the states parties, not those that recognize the jurisdiction of ICC. So it was decided that it's not the way that would really help fighting impunity in some effective way, and that's why the idea was dropped. But just theoretically, it was discussed, and I think it's not a closed discussion for the scholars dealing with aggression.
Thank you very much. There is another question by Matthias Meindl, and I quote, "I was interested to hear that crimes by the Ukrainian side are also documented, which is good, of course. But will this not lead into a paradoxical situation in which courts would mainly be able to prosecute these cases, while the Russian perpetrators of crimes are rarely going to appear in front of a court?"
It's a very good question, as I already mentioned, but the answer would not be that complicated either. So first of all, Ukrainian courts may prosecute in absentia without having Russian perpetrators or organizers or commanders in the courtroom. And that would, of course, allow Ukrainian courts to go after many Russian war criminals before or together with dealing with some cases of war crimes committed by potentially Ukrainian military. So for Ukrainian courts, the situation would not look like that. Of course, when it comes to real terms, so implementation of real penalties to the alleged perpetrators, that would be a challenge, since most of Russian war criminals would not be available for the Ukrainian judicial system. But still, in terms of just cases, there will be much more cases involving Russian war crime than Ukrainian, that's for sure. And as for the ICC operates on the basis of the principle of complementarity, which means that ICC does not investigate cases that other states are ready and fully capable to investigate. So when it comes to Ukraine, most probably the ICC will not look at these cases, because Ukraine showed during the previous 8 years willingness and ability to investigate war crimes. So probably the ICC will go after Russians. And another issue is that, of course, ICC can't operate on the basis of principle in absentia, or can't prosecute people without having them in courtroom. So that means that the thing that we can really expect from the ICC now is just indicting certain Russian officials or Russian perpetrators.
Thank you. Kateryna, do you want to add anything to that?
I would probably just add that on the one hand, there is the big criticism of in absentia trials, and the notorious example would be the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that has cost a lot of money and works in absentia. On the other hand, it's the rationale both of the Ukrainian government, but I think it does make sense that, for instance, the aggression proceedings could take place in absentia, because we should not underestimate the importance of the narrative, the importance of the narrative that comes out of the very thorough and impartial analysis of the facts and law that could still be still be done in absentia. So I think we should really differentiate what type of a trial we're speaking about, be it the trial of a potential perpetrator of alleged war crimes or crimes against humanity, or be that the aggression proceedings. And of course, I would love to bring the example of the universal jurisdiction proceedings related to the Syrian armed conflict. And this and the previous year, we have seen the increase in the quite unprecedented judgments, both in relation to Syria and in relation to the Yazidi, the crimes against the Yazidi community, for instance, in Germany, when still years after the violations, because both the perpetrators and the victims traveled to the EU and were trying to get the refugee status, the proceedings still did happen in person and the criminals were brought to justice. So still there are options, but of course, many of them will depend also on the time framework and how the people travel, and also what does happen with the political regime in Russia.
Yes, thank you. I think the next question is very closely related to what we already spoke about. Anna Hasselmann asks, do you see ways for Ukraine to bring war criminals to justice who live in Russia after the war? But I don't know whether you want to add anything to what you already said, because this is very close to what we already discussed, I think. Although, of course, this is a very practical question as well.
Do you want to start, Kateryna?
Well, I think, to be honest, I'll be repeating myself that it will depend first on the type of the crime which is attributable to this person. With the crime of aggression, I think it would make sense to start the proceeding, to start building this narrative and perhaps even rendering a judgment, even in absentia. And that would create an important statement of facts and the judgment of history and law, not only for the Ukrainian people, but also for the Belarusian people and for the Russian people, because it's up to them to support the reform within their country. It's up to their civil society to rise, right? And on the other hand, when we speak about the people who are allegedly responsible for war crimes, they still might travel, and second, there's also a possibility that, again, the new regime might want to, for instance, extradite certain persons for the proceedings, for instance, for lifting certain or softening certain sanctions. This is, of course, a possible scenario, but I'm just thinking about the possible models. But that, I think that will depend largely on what crime we are speaking about, and also what type of a regime we see in Russia.
Many thanks. I see we're already, I think we could go on for hours, but I see we're already over time. So, and as there seem to be no further questions, apart from dozens of questions on my own list, well, I want to thank Kateryna, Dmytro, both of you, for this really, really interesting and insightful presentation, and wish you best of luck and wish your country best of luck. And thanks to all our listeners and all those who asked questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks a lot to all the people in the audience for the patience for such a grave subject late in the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.